The air in Federal Courtroom 3B was thick with an almost palpable tension, a stillness that preceded a storm. Across the polished oak of the defendant's table sat men and women once untouchable, their faces now stripped of their usual arrogance. Agent Martin Reed, a man whose smirk had been a local legend, clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between the stern faces of the federal prosecutors. Beside him, Prosecutor Jacob Smith, usually radiating an insufferable condescension, stared fixedly at the scuffed surface of the table, his knuckles white. Other local officials, their names once whispered with a mix of fear and reverence in the city's corridors of power, sat rigid, their tailored suits doing little to hide their burgeoning dread. The charges read aloud were a litany of betrayal, systematic abuse of power, falsification of evidence, obstruction of justice, and a sprawling network of corruption that had poisoned the community for years. Each word, clipped and precise, chipped away at their last vestiges of denial. This wasn't a local court where they could pull strings. This was federal territory, the endgame. A hush fell over the room as the door to the judge's chambers opened. All eyes, especially those of the defendants, snapped towards the figure who emerged. There was a collective, almost imperceptible gasp from the gallery. Reed's breath hitched, and Smith's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief, then horror. Standing tall, cloaked in the severe black robes of a federal judge, was Amara James. Her gaze swept across the courtroom, landing for a fraction of a second on the defendants. It was a look devoid of overt triumph, yet pregnant with an ancient, unwavering resolve. Her face was an impassive mask of justice, but behind her steady eyes lay the ghost of a past injustice, now fully embodied in her unassailable authority. 5 years ago, 5 years prior, the name Amara James resonated with a different kind of authority, one built on meticulous preparation and an unyielding moral compass. She was a senior associate at Sterling and Finch, a prestigious law firm whose towering glass facade cast a long shadow over the older, brick-and-mortar institutions of the city. Amara, a formidable figure even in her late 20s, was in the midst of her ascent, a rising star in the cutthroat world of corporate litigation, though her true passion lay in civil rights and systemic reform. Today, she stood before a packed courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a relentless advocate. Her client, a small community co-op, was being squeezed out by a predatory real estate conglomerate. Amara's voice, clear and resonant, sliced through the stale air as she dismantled the opposition's closing arguments. She didn't shout. She reasoned, her arguments building like an unassailable fortress of logic and precedent. Her words were laced with a quiet fire, a subtle reminder of the injustices she sought to correct. The judge, a seasoned veteran, watched her with a nod of respect, a silent acknowledgement of her prowess. The jury, captivated, hung on her every word. It was a masterclass in legal strategy, culminating in a swift, decisive victory that sent a ripple of murmurs through the gallery. Later that afternoon, amidst the controlled chaos of the firm's bustling offices, Amara exuded a quiet satisfaction. Her colleagues offered congratulations, some genuine, some tinged with envy. She moved through the corridors with an understated grace, a woman who knew her worth and carried the weight of her ambition with dignity. Her journey hadn't been easy. A scholarship student from a working-class neighborhood, she had defied expectations and navigated academic and professional landscapes often hostile to someone of her background. This constant uphill battle had forged her into the formidable force she was today, resilient, analytical, and fiercely independent. As the sun began to dip below the city's skyline, painting the office in hues of orange and purple, Amara gathered her briefcase. A stack of pro bono case files, marginalized communities seeking justice, lay neatly on her desk, awaiting her attention. These were the cases that truly fueled her, a silent promise to herself to use her growing power for a greater good. The corporate battles funded her, but these were the battles for her soul. Stepping out into the cool evening air, the city hummed with the promise of a Friday night. Amara, however, had a quiet evening planned, poring over legal texts, perhaps a documentary. She unlocked her modest, yet reliable, sedan. As she pulled away from the curb, a flash of red and blue flickered in her rearview mirror. A routine traffic stop, she presumed, probably for a slightly expired parking meter she'd forgotten to feed in her rush this morning. A minor inconvenience, easily rectified with a polite explanation and a small fine. Or so she thought. The cruiser's siren gave a short, sharp wail, an order, not a request. Amara sighed, pulling over, unaware that this mundane moment was about to ignite the fuse of her carefully laid plans and set her on a collision course with the very system she intended to dismantle. Amara lowered her window, her movements calm and measured. The sun was almost gone, painting the sky in deep purples, but a heavy, oppressive stillness hung in the air. An officer approached her car slowly, his broad figure casting a long shadow. Agent Martin Reed. His badge gleamed in the dying light. He was a local legend, not for valor, but for his arrogant, almost tyrannical approach to maintaining order. His gaze, unhidden, conveyed a sense of superiority, a habit of seeing everyone not in uniform as a potential transgressor to be taught a lesson. Problems, ma'am. His voice was acerbic, dripping with passive aggression, yet deceptively polite. He didn't even glance at her documents, which Amara already held ready. Officer, good evening. I presume this is about the parking? I can. Reed cut her off with a raised hand, his smile thin. No rush. I have a more interesting surprise for you. You seem to have forgotten to use your turn signal when pulling out of the parking spot. And, your registration looks suspicious. Amara frowned. She was certain she had used her turn signal. As for the registration, it was perfectly in order. Officer, my documents are entirely in order. I am an attorney, and I assure you that. At the word attorney, Reed scoffed. Oh, we hadn't guessed. Another smart one. All right, attorney, step out of the car. His voice now held an undisguised mockery. Amara complied, feeling a cold fury building within her, but her face remained impassive. She knew this game. He was trying to provoke her, to then accuse her of resisting. She took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. Now, madam, Reed moved uncomfortably close, his gaze sweeping over her business suit. I find your behavior extremely suspicious. Nervous. Trying to hide something. What do you have in your car, huh? He began a search without any apparent legal justification. He intentionally ignored her questions about the reason for the search, merely waving them off. At that moment, another car pulled up. A man in an expensive suit, with a smug smile, emerged. It was Jacob Smith, an assistant district attorney whom Amara had clashed with several times in court. He was known as Reed's lapdog, always ready to back his actions, especially when it involved unruly citizens. Martin, what do we have here? Smith drawled, his arrogant gaze settling on Amara. Oh, look, Miss James. A pleasure to see you in such an unexpected situation. His words were like a veiled blow, wrapped in false civility. Reed's smirk widened. Well, Jacob, it seems our esteemed attorney here was trying to evade justice. Charges of resisting arrest, perhaps driving without a license. We'll see what else we find. Driving without a license. That's absurd. My documents are in my hands. Amara held up her folder. Smith merely gave a condescending nod. Miss James, no need to be so agitated. Just cooperate. Or are you afraid we'll find something interesting? His gaze was filled with derision, as if to say, we know who you are, and we won't let you get away with it. Amara felt the ground shift beneath her. This wasn't just a minor infraction. This was a targeted attack, a planned humiliation. They didn't just want to issue a fine. They wanted to break her, to show her who was in charge. And in this local system, where Reed and Smith were an inseparable duo, her voice, her authority, her legal rights seemed powerless. But instead of succumbing to panic or anger, a new, cold spark flickered in her eyes. The game had only just begun. The courthouse was a monument to local power, its stone facade weathered but unyielding, a stark contrast to the modern glass towers Amara usually frequented. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee, and a pervasive sense of weary resignation seemed to cling to the sparse attendees. Amara found herself standing before a judge whose weary eyes held a familiar, almost rote, skepticism when looking at her. Local Judge Wallace, a man whose tenure had weathered countless storms, seemed more concerned with moving cases than with the nuances of justice. Reed and Smith were there, of course, positioned conspicuously, their postures radiating smug satisfaction. Reed, still in uniform, leaned against a wall, occasionally exchanging low, contemptuous remarks with Smith, who, impeccably dressed, stood beside him, a preening gargoyle. Their eyes, whenever they met Amara's, held a challenge, a silent dare for her to react, to show weakness. Miss James, the court has reviewed the charges brought by Officer Reed and the preliminary assessment by Prosecutor Smith, Judge Wallace stated, his voice flat. Resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and a fabricated claim of driving without proper documentation, which has, of course, been dismissed, but the initial suspicion warranted further investigation, according to the prosecution. Amara clenched her jaw. The dismissed charge was a pathetic attempt to save face after her documents proved irrefutable. But the other charges, flimsy as they were, still stood. Your Honor, these charges are baseless. Officer Reed initiated an unlawful search and escalated a minor traffic stop into a targeted harassment. Before Judge Wallace could respond, Smith stepped forward, a patronizing smile plastered on his face. With all due respect, Your Honor, the defendant's emotional response and aggressive demeanor during the stop clearly indicate resistance. Officer Reed acted within his rights to maintain order. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over Amara, a calculated microaggression. It seems Miss James, despite her professional background, struggles with respect for authority when it's not on her terms. Reed let out a soft, contemptuous chuckle. It was barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Amara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she suppressed it. This wasn't about winning this minor skirmish. This was about something far larger. Her eyes, however, weren't solely focused on her tormentors. Subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, was the faint red glow of her phone's recording light, nestled discreetly in the inner pocket of her blazer. Every sneer, every dismissive wave, every veiled insult, it was all being captured. Her mind, sharp and analytical, was already filing away each transgression, categorizing it, preparing it for future use. This wasn't just a phone, it was her hidden mechanism. Judge Wallace, seemingly weary of the entire affair, raised a hand. I've heard enough. While the charges of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct appear to be on the lower end of the spectrum, the court finds sufficient basis to impose a minor fine and a probationary period. Case closed. He banged his gavel, his eyes already looking at the next file. A triumphant smirk flashed across Reed's face. Smith offered a saccharine, mocking nod. Amara, however, remained still. She accepted the judgment, not out of defeat, but out of strategic patience. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Smith's one last time. His smugness was absolute. He thought he had won. He had no idea what he had truly unleashed. Outside the courthouse, the evening had deepened. The city lights began to twinkle. Amara walked towards her car, her stride purposeful. As she opened the door, her phone vibrated, signaling the completion of the recording. With a thumb tap, she accessed her secure cloud storage. A new folder appeared, read_Smith_files. Inside, the audio file was instantly uploaded, meticulously labeled with the date, time, and location. It wasn't just a recording. It was the first brick in a colossal structure of evidence. Amara looked at the courthouse, a monolithic symbol of local power, its windows dark and unseeing. She hadn't just endured an injustice. She had collected a crucial piece of the puzzle. The game had truly begun, and she was playing for far higher stakes than a mere fine. The probationary period was a minor inconvenience, a smudge on Amara's pristine professional record that she mitigated with exceptional performance and strategic networking. The incident with Reed and Smith, though personally galling, became a silent catalyst. It didn't break her. It sharpened her resolve, reinforcing her long-held belief that true change required penetrating the very heart of the system. She understood, with chilling clarity, that the local corruption wasn't just about individual bad actors. It was endemic, woven into the fabric of power structures, protected by layers of complicity and apathy. The immediate aftermath saw Amara doubling down on her work at Sterling and Finch. She took on more complex cases, her reputation as a formidable litigator growing with each victory. Yet, beneath the surface of her corporate successes, a new, meticulously planned strategy began to unfold. She enrolled in an intensive, specialized program focused on federal judicial processes and constitutional law, often spending late nights poring over dense legal texts. This wasn't merely about career advancement. It was about acquiring a specific toolkit, learning the intricacies of federal oversight, and understanding how to leverage its power. She consciously steered her career towards the federal track. Opportunities arose, first as a legal counsel for a congressional committee investigating governmental ethics, then as a senior attorney within a federal agency dedicated to civil rights enforcement. Each step was a calculated move, bringing her closer to the levers of true, impartial justice. She wasn't seeking a shortcut. She was building a foundation, brick by painstaking brick, ensuring that when she finally struck, her position would be unassailable. During these years, the folder read_Smith_files in her secure cloud storage remained dormant but not forgotten. It was her secret, her personal crusade, but it was also a living document. She subscribed to local news feeds, setting up automated alerts for any mention of Officer Martin Reed, Assistant District Attorney Jacob Smith, or the police precinct and DA's office they operated within. She meticulously clipped articles, cross-referencing names, looking for patterns. Minor incidents, dismissed complaints, questionable arrests, sudden resignations of whistleblowers began to paint a larger picture. It was a mosaic of petty abuses, veiled threats, and institutional neglect. One article, in particular, caught her attention: a local reporter's expose on a surge in minor drug offenses in low-income neighborhoods, all prosecuted by Smith and often involving arrests by Reed, leading to disproportionately harsh sentences. The article was quickly buried, dismissed by local officials as sensationalism. But Amara saw the threads, the systematic targeting. She cross-referenced the names, looking for parallels to her own case, people who likely lacked the legal resources to fight back. She developed an almost surgical precision in her networking. She cultivated relationships with federal judges, U.S. attorneys, and high-ranking officials at the Department of Justice. She didn't reveal her ultimate agenda, of course, but she spoke passionately about systemic injustice, about the erosion of public trust in local law enforcement, about the need for robust federal oversight. She positioned herself as a champion of integrity, a voice for the voiceless, earning the respect of those who shared her ideals but perhaps lacked the specific focus or the sheer strategic patience she possessed. Amara was no longer just a brilliant lawyer. She was becoming a master strategist, moving pieces on a chessboard few even knew existed. The incident from 5 years ago had been a wound, but it had also been an awakening. She carried it not as a scar of victimhood, but as a burning ember of purpose, fueling her relentless march towards a position where she could finally unleash the hidden mechanism she had so patiently constructed. The stage was being set, not for a personal vendetta, but for a systemic reckoning. Years passed. Amara's trajectory soared, taking her far beyond the provincial confines of her initial humiliation. She moved from the Department of Justice to a federal appeals court, serving as a highly respected judicial clerk. Then, following a grueling confirmation process, she ascended to the bench of a federal district court. Her reputation was impeccable: sharp intellect, unwavering adherence to the law, and a quiet, formidable presence that commanded respect. She was now, undeniably, a part of the higher system she had meticulously sought to join. The read_Smith_files folder, once a solitary repository of her personal grievance, had expanded. It now contained dozens of supplementary documents, anonymous tips forwarded to her through her network, snippets from local news archives, public records requests filed under various guises, and intricate flowcharts mapping the connections between local officials, police, and the district attorney's office. She didn't actively pursue them in her official capacity yet, but she nurtured her intelligence network like a master gardener, ensuring it provided a steady stream of pertinent information. Meanwhile, back in the city where Amara's journey of systemic change had truly begun, Officer Martin Reed and Prosecutor Jacob Smith were still operating with impunity, though not entirely without ripples. Their antics, once brushed aside as merely local color, began to draw faint, sporadic attention from outside their immediate circle. A federal grant for police reform was unexpectedly delayed for their precinct, citing administrative irregularities. A minor audit of the DA's office highlighted discrepancies in case dispositions, particularly for cases involving low-income defendants. These were mere whispers, easily dismissed by the local brass as bureaucratic nuisances or the meddling of overzealous federal agencies. Smith, ever confident, would often joke about it in the station house. "Another federal busybody trying to tell us how to do our jobs," he'd scoff, usually to Reed's appreciative chuckle. "They have no idea how things really work down here. They'll poke around, find nothing, and go back to their ivory towers." Reed, emboldened by Smith's unwavering support, continued to operate as he always had, his petty acts of intimidation escalating into slightly more serious abuses, confident in the layers of protection afforded by his network. Amara, from her federal chambers, noticed these whispers. She didn't openly connect them to her burgeoning case. Instead, she used her position to subtly redirect resources. During a quarterly meeting with federal marshals and U.S. attorneys regarding judicial security and local law enforcement cooperation, she brought up the need for proactive engagement with communities where public trust in local police is reportedly low. She specifically mentioned her former city as an example, framing it as a neutral, data-driven concern. "We're seeing a pattern of complaints that, while individually minor, collectively paint a worrying picture," Amara stated, her voice calm and authoritative, referencing a generalized, unspecific report she had compiled from public data. "It suggests potential systemic issues that, if unaddressed, could undermine the very foundation of justice in these areas. Federal intervention, in the form of independent review and perhaps targeted outreach, could restore that trust." The suggestion, coming from a respected federal judge, was met with thoughtful nods. A deputy U.S. attorney, a woman named Lena Hansen known for her integrity and sharp legal mind, looked at Amara with keen interest. "Judge James, your insights are always valuable. Do you have any specific recommendations for a pilot program or an investigative approach?" Amara offered a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. "Not yet, Miss Hansen, but I believe a deeper dive into the procedural discrepancies and public complaints in that region would be highly beneficial. Perhaps a preliminary fact-finding mission, not overtly punitive, but geared towards understanding underlying issues. We need to identify the rot before it spreads." The wheels had begun to turn, not in a dramatic, overt fashion, but with the quiet, inexorable force of a federal initiative. Reed and Smith, still basking in their local power, would feel the faint tremors, but they would dismiss them as distant thunder, unaware that the lightning strike was being carefully orchestrated by the very woman they had once so casually scorned. Lena Hansen, the deputy U.S. attorney, proved to be an invaluable asset. She was astute enough to pick up on the subtle, unstated gravity in Judge James's suggestions. Under the guise of a community trust initiative, she dispatched a small, discreet team of federal investigators to the city, focusing their efforts initially on public records and statistical anomalies rather than direct accusations. Amara, from her federal chambers, pulled the strings with masterful precision, never directly interfering but strategically guiding the investigative focus. The initial findings were innocuous enough to avoid raising immediate alarms within the local power structure. The federal team identified an unusually high number of resisting arrest charges in certain neighborhoods, a statistically improbable correlation between specific officers and a high volume of misdemeanor arrests, and a pattern of dismissed complaints against law enforcement within the Internal Affairs Division. These were the threads Amara had been seeking. Amara, now a federal judge, possessed the authority to request broad data sets from various federal and state agencies. She initiated routine audits of certain federal grants allocated to local law enforcement, ostensibly to ensure compliance. These audits, on the surface, were about financial accountability, but for Amara, they were a Trojan horse. They allowed her access to personnel records, incident reports, and internal communications that would otherwise be shielded. Her sharp legal mind, honed by years of intricate litigation, could spot a fabricated report or a conveniently lost document from a mile away. The local system, however, was not entirely blind. Whispers began to circulate. Officers grumbled about feds breathing down our necks over paperwork. Prosecutors complained about unnecessary scrutiny, slowing down their caseload. Reed and Smith, at first, merely scoffed. Just the feds trying to justify their salaries, Smith would say, waving off concerns. They'll find nothing. We're clean. But the federal team wasn't looking for major corruption, not yet. They were meticulously piecing together patterns of behavior, building a comprehensive database of incidents. One of the investigators, a young, idealistic FBI agent named Mark Jenkins, stumbled upon a series of anonymous complaints filed years ago against Officer Reed, complaints that had been consistently unsubstantiated by local internal affairs. Jenkins cross-referenced these with the Reed_Smith and Fissenfer files Amara had anonymously provided to Hansen's team via a secure, untraceable drop-off point, masked as a tip from a disgruntled former city employee. The provided recordings of Amara's humiliation from 5 years prior, combined with similar accounts, suddenly painted a chillingly consistent picture. As the investigation deepened, Amara leveraged her connections. She discreetly reached out to former colleagues, now working in different federal capacities, asking for informal insights into the city's political landscape. She found many who were privately disillusioned with the entrenched corruption, but who had felt powerless to act. These were the honest but frustrated individuals she had sought to cultivate. They provided context, names of potential witnesses, and insights into the specific ways the local system protected its own. The resistance, initially passive, began to grow more active. Witnesses who had tentatively agreed to speak with federal agents suddenly recanted their statements, citing memory loss or misunderstanding. Records requested by the federal team were delayed or arrived incomplete. Attempts were made to discredit Agent Jenkins and his team, painting them as overzealous or prejudiced. Amara anticipated this. She had briefed Hansen on the likely countermeasures. "They will try to shut you down, Lena," Amara had warned in a veiled phone call, using a secure line. "They've done it before. Every time someone gets close, they activate their own defense mechanisms. You need to be unassailable." This resistance, paradoxically, was precisely what Amara needed. It confirmed the depth of the systemic rot. The local system, in its desperate attempts to cover its tracks, was inadvertently revealing the full extent of its complicity. Each obstruction, each intimidation, was another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin. The Community Trust Initiative was no longer just about trust. It was rapidly evolving into a full-scale federal investigation. The net was closing, and Reed and Smith, though still somewhat oblivious, were directly in its path. The Community Trust Initiative was now far beyond preliminary fact-finding. Agent Jenkins's team, under Lena Hansen's direction and Amara's strategic oversight, had dug deep, and what they unearthed was a horrifying tapestry of systemic abuse. The Reed_Smith_Fergus_ files provided the initial roadmap, but the investigation quickly spiraled into something far more pervasive than mere individual misconduct. They uncovered a sophisticated network of corruption that extended far beyond a couple of arrogant officers and a cynical prosecutor. There were documented instances of police officers, including Reed, routinely fabricating probable cause for arrests in low-income neighborhoods, particularly targeting minority residents. These arrests often involved minor infractions, but the subsequent charges, inflated by Smith's office, would leave individuals with criminal records that severely hampered their ability to find employment or housing. The Internal Affairs Division, supposedly a check on police misconduct, was revealed to be a rubber stamp. Complaints against officers, especially Reed, were consistently unsubstantiated, often after superficial reviews and without interviewing key witnesses. Whistleblowers within the police department had been systematically sidelined, transferred to undesirable shifts, or forced into early retirement. Amara's subtle queries to her network of honest but frustrated contacts yielded the names and contact details of some of these individuals, who, now under federal protection, began to tell their stories. The district attorney's office, headed by the long-serving DA Robert Vance, was also deeply implicated. Smith, Vance's protege, was not an anomaly but a symptom of a larger problem. The team found evidence of plea bargains being coerced through intimidation, critical evidence being misplaced or lost in cases involving politically connected individuals, and a clear pattern of racial bias in sentencing recommendations. Amara's own case, where she had been falsely accused and humiliated, was revealed to be a textbook example of how this local system operated. Target, provoke, humiliate, and then use the resulting charges to assert dominance and suppress any challenge to their authority. One particularly damning discovery involved a confidential informant program. Reed and Smith had allegedly used vulnerable individuals from the very communities they policed, coercing them into acting as informants under threat of harsher sentences or immigration issues. These informants were then used to set up others, creating a cycle of arrests and prosecutions that fueled the system and justified their tough-on-crime image. Federal agents found evidence that several of these informants had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, their cases conveniently closed by local authorities. The federal team also exposed the financial threads connecting the abuse of power to personal enrichment. While Reed and Smith might not have been directly lining their pockets with large sums, they were enjoying perks, political favors, and unspoken protection from local businesses and influential figures who benefited from their orderly, oppressive policing of certain areas. The entire structure was a self-perpetuating machine, crushing dissent and maintaining a toxic status quo. Lena Hansen, poring over the mountains of evidence, felt a chill run down her spine. Judge James was right. She murmured to Agent Jenkins one late night in their makeshift command center. This isn't just a few bad apples. It's the whole orchard, rotten to the core. This is bigger than anything we anticipated. Amara, receiving regular, anonymized updates, felt a grim satisfaction. The recordings from her phone, the discreet public records requests, the careful networking, it had all culminated in this. The full horror of the local system was finally being laid bare, not by an individual screaming against the wind, but by the relentless, methodical force of the federal justice system she had so skillfully activated. Pandora's box was open, and its contents were spilling out for all to see. The quiet whispers in the corridors of local power had escalated into a frantic clamor. The Community Trust Initiative was no longer a discreet federal inquiry. It was a full-blown federal investigation, spearheaded by Lena Hansen's U.S. Attorney's Office, with visible FBI presence. Subpoenas flew, witnesses were interviewed under federal protection, and local officials, from the mayor's office down to precinct captains, found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. The sheer scale of the unearthed corruption, from falsified police reports to coerced plea deals and the suspicious disappearance of informants, made it impossible for even the most entrenched cronies to dismiss. District Attorney Robert Vance, Jacob Smith's mentor and a linchpin of the local power structure, was among the first to grasp the true gravity of the situation. His phone calls to old friends in state government and even some low-level federal contacts, once met with reassuring platitudes, now returned only nervous silences or vague promises of looking into it. The federal shield around Hansen's team was impenetrable. Panic began to set in amongst the implicated. Reed and Smith, once swaggering with unshakable confidence, now moved with a palpable unease. Their once unquestioning support network began to fray. Fellow officers avoided eye contact, and even Judge Wallace, the same judge who had so casually dismissed Amara's pleas years ago, began to distance himself, canceling scheduled meetings and refusing calls from Vance's office. The local system that had so diligently protected them was now showing cracks, its foundations eroding under the relentless pressure of federal oversight. "This is all a witch hunt, Jake." Reed fumed in Smith's office, slamming his fist on the desk. "They're coming after us because we actually do our jobs. They want to dismantle everything." Smith, though outwardly calmer, had a haunted look in his eyes. He knew Amara James was involved, somehow. The sudden intensity of the federal focus, the targeted questions about specific cases from years ago, it was too precise. He had tried to downplay it, but the fear was a cold knot in his stomach. "It's more than that, Martin. They found something. Something deep. Vance is running scared. He's already lawyered up, tried to blame me for some of the earlier audits." The local power structure, in its desperation, activated its own defense mechanisms. Attempts were made to discredit the federal investigation. Anonymous leaks to local media accusing the FBI of overreach and racial bias. Veiled threats against the families of potential witnesses, attempts to hack into federal databases, all thwarted by robust cybersecurity. Political pressure was exerted on state representatives to publicly condemn the federal interference. But Amara, from her federal perch, had anticipated these moves. She had, in fact, subtly nudged the federal team to fortify their defenses against such tactics. Under her guidance, Hansen had established an impenetrable chain of custody for all evidence, ensured witness protection was immediately offered, and preemptively contacted key media outlets with a promise of full transparency once the investigation concluded. Any attempts to obstruct or retaliate merely added to the pile of charges being prepared. The pressure mounted on Reed and Smith. They tried to intimidate more witnesses, subtly at first, then more overtly. They attempted to tamper with remaining evidence in their precinct, only to find that key files had already been secured by federal agents weeks prior through a pre-dawn raid. Their desperation grew with each failed attempt, their confidence crumbling into paranoia. One evening, Jacob Smith, alone in his office, received an anonymous, encrypted email. It contained a single audio file. He played it, and his blood ran cold. It was the recording of Amara James's court hearing 5 years ago, crystal clear, every sneer, every microaggression, every contemptuous chuckle captured with chilling fidelity. His own patronizing words echoed in the sterile office. A shiver ran down his spine. He immediately understood. The woman they had humiliated was not just a victim. She was the architect of their downfall. And she had been playing the long game. The invisible war was now visible, the battle lines drawn. The higher system, silently activated and meticulously guided by Amara James, was poised to strike. The stage was set for the final act, where the self-proclaimed kings of their local domain would finally face their judge. The federal courthouse on Elm Street was packed. Every seat in courtroom 3B was taken, a tense silence hanging over the spectators, reporters, and legal professionals. The air hummed with anticipation. This wasn't just another trial. It was the culmination of years of quiet, meticulous work, a reckoning for a system that had long believed itself immune. On the defendant's table sat the once untouchable figures. Martin Reed, his uniform now replaced by a drab suit, looked a shadow of his former arrogant self. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, darting nervously around the room. Beside him, Jacob Smith, though still attempting to maintain an air of professional composure, had a tick in his jaw that betrayed his profound unease. District Attorney Robert Vance, older and more visibly shaken, sat ramrod straight, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The arrogance, the smugness, the sense of impunity that had once defined them was utterly gone, replaced by a raw, palpable fear. The charges were read: racketeering, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Each count a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the edifice of power they had so carefully constructed. The federal prosecutor, a stoic and formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to the DA, laid out the government's opening statement with clinical precision, detailing the intricate web of corruption that had ensnared the city. She spoke of falsified records, coerced confessions, disappeared evidence, and the systematic targeting of vulnerable communities. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened. Every head in the courtroom turned. A hush fell, broken only by the rustle of clothing and the click of cameras. Amara James entered. She walked with an assured, steady gait, her federal robes flowing around her, a symbol of the immense authority she now wielded. Her face was serene, devoid of any discernible emotion, yet her presence filled the room, demanding attention. She ascended to the bench, her eyes sweeping across the gallery, then landing, for a chilling moment, on the defendant's table. Reed's eyes widened, a soundless gasp catching in his throat. Smith's face drained of all color, his cultivated composure shattering into a mosaic of disbelief and dawning horror. Vance, initially confused, followed their gaze, and a wave of nausea washed over him as recognition dawned. The woman they had once humiliated, the smart one they had tried to put in her place, was now presiding over their fate. The memory of her calm, unwavering gaze from 5 years ago, as they ridiculed her, now became a terrifying prophecy. Judge James settled into her chair, her gaze fixed on the defendants. "Good morning, counsel." Good morning, defendants. Are we ready to proceed? Her voice was clear, resonant, and utterly impartial, yet it carried an undeniable weight, an echo of justice long deferred. The federal prosecutor, Eleanor Vance, presented the first piece of evidence, the audio recording. Your Honor, our first exhibit is an audio file, dated 5 years ago, from an incident involving Defendant Martin Reed and Defendant Jacob Smith, and a then civilian, Ms. Amara James. It captures a segment of an unlawful stop and subsequent harassment. The courtroom speakers crackled, and then the familiar, contemptuous voice of Martin Reed filled the air. Problems, ma'am? Followed by Jacob Smith's sneering tone. Miss James, no need to be so agitated. Just cooperate. Or are you afraid we'll find something interesting? And Reed's muffled, derisive chuckle. Every microaggression, every passive-aggressive jab, every word of humiliation was amplified, filling the solemn courtroom, a chilling echo of the past. The defendants listened, their faces contorted in a mixture of shame and fury, knowing that their own words were now condemning them. Amara James, on the bench, listened impassively, a silent, unwavering arbiter of the justice they had denied her and countless others. The trap, so carefully set and patiently baited, had finally sprung. The trial stretched for weeks, a meticulously orchestrated symphony of evidence and testimony. Each day brought fresh revelations, meticulously laid out by prosecutor Eleanor Vance and her team, who built their case brick by damning brick. Martin Reed and Jacob Smith, along with their co-defendants, found themselves utterly exposed, stripped bare of their power and their carefully constructed lies. The defense, led by a high-priced but increasingly desperate legal team, attempted to deploy their old tactics. They tried to discredit the federal agents, painting them as overzealous and biased. They attempted to intimidate witnesses, but the federal protection was unwavering, and their efforts merely served to strengthen the prosecution's narrative of obstruction. They even tried to argue that the original audio recording, Amara's hidden mechanism, was somehow illegally obtained or tampered with. Your Honor, Smith's attorney argued, his voice wavering under Judge James's steady gaze. This recording, allegedly made by the original complainant, Ms. James herself, is highly prejudicial and could be fabricated. Amara James leaned forward, her voice calm but piercing. Counsel, the authenticity of the recording has been thoroughly verified by federal forensics. Furthermore, a citizen's right to record interactions with law enforcement in a public space is protected. Unless you have new, verifiable evidence to the contrary, the recording stands as entered evidence. Proceed, prosecutor. Her ruling was absolute, unyielding. The parade of witnesses was devastating. Former police officers, once silenced, now testified to Reed's routine abuse of power, his racist taunts, and his habit of planting evidence. Vulnerable citizens, many of whom had been ensnared in Reed and Smith's informant scheme, recounted harrowing tales of coercion, threats, and fabricated charges. Even Judge Wallace, now implicated in the cover-up of minor complaints, was forced to testify, his memory suddenly much clearer under the threat of federal perjury charges. His hesitant admissions painted a stark picture of a judiciary corrupted by complacency and fear. The most damning testimony came from Agent Mark Jenkins, who presented a forensic analysis of years of arrest records, court dispositions, and internal affairs reports. He revealed irrefutable statistical patterns of racial bias, disproportionate sentencing, and a systematic cover-up within the police department and DA's office. He detailed how lost evidence was conveniently found for some defendants, while critical exculpatory evidence disappeared for others, particularly those from marginalized communities. Reed and Smith, for all their bluster, crumbled under cross-examination. Reed became belligerent, his answers evasive, his anger thinly veiled. Smith, ever the lawyer, attempted to parse words and deflect blame, but his carefully constructed facade cracked under the weight of the evidence. He was forced to admit to prioritizing certain cases over others, to overlooking procedural irregularities, and to being unaware of Reed's more egregious actions, a claim that rang hollow against the mountain of evidence proving their close collaboration. Throughout it all, Judge Amara James presided with an unwavering hand. She was the embodiment of impartial justice, yet her every precise question, her every firm ruling, carried the quiet authority of someone who understood, intimately, the pain and injustice that had unfolded in her courtroom. There was no personal vendetta in her demeanor, only the relentless pursuit of truth. On the final day of the trial, after closing arguments that painted a grim picture of systemic corruption and human suffering, the jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, their faces grim but resolute, the verdict was unanimous. We find the defendants, Martin Reed, Jacob Smith, and Robert Vance, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Reed slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. Smith stared blankly ahead, his jaw slack, the last vestiges of his arrogance finally stripped away. Robert Vance seemed to age 10 years in an instant, his political career and personal legacy utterly destroyed. Amara James looked at the defendants, her expression unreadable. She raised her gavel. The resounding thud that followed echoed through the silent room, a final, definitive stroke against injustice. The local system, once so secure in its corrupt embrace, had met its match. The sentencing hearing was brief, potent, and utterly devoid of the theatrics that had often characterized the defendants' careers. Judge Amara James, her voice steady and clear, delivered sentences that reflected the severity and systemic nature of their crimes. Martin Reed received the harshest penalty, decades in federal prison for racketeering, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. Jacob Smith's sentence was substantial, acknowledging his complicity and the abuse of his prosecutorial power. Even Robert Vance, the former district attorney, faced significant time for his role in orchestrating and covering up the corruption, his once sterling reputation irrevocably tarnished. As the sentences were pronounced, Reed raged, his composure finally snapping, yelling obscenities that were quickly cut short by the federal marshals. Smith, defeated, merely stared at the floor, a broken man. The public gallery, filled with victims and advocates, released a collective, cathartic sigh. Justice, after a long and arduous journey, had finally been served. Later that week, in a press conference held on the steps of the federal courthouse, Lena Hansen and Agent Mark Jenkins addressed a throng of reporters. They detailed the scope of the investigation, the convictions, and the broader implications. "This case sends a clear message," Hansen stated, her voice firm. "No one, regardless of their position, is above the law. The federal government will not tolerate systemic corruption that erodes public trust and denies citizens their fundamental rights." Amara James, however, chose a different platform for her final message. Not a public speech, but a judicial order, signed and filed in her chambers. It was a comprehensive directive, born from the very evidence unearthed during the trial, initiating the Federal Oversight and Reform Commission for Local Justice Systems. This commission, with federal funding and broad powers, was tasked with a multi-year mandate to conduct independent audits of police departments and district attorneys' offices nationwide, develop best practices for accountability and transparency, and establish robust channels for citizen complaints, ensuring they bypass compromised local structures. It was a blueprint for systemic change, a mechanism designed to prevent such corruption from ever taking root again. It was her legacy. In the quiet of her chambers, after the frenzy of the trial and the solemn duty of sentencing, Amara stood by the large window, looking out over the city. The sun, now golden and warm, cast long shadows across the urban landscape. 5 years ago, in a similar evening light, she had sat in her car, humiliated but resolute, activating her hidden mechanism. Now, that mechanism had brought down an entire corrupt edifice, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating force of truth and federal authority. She remembered the feeling of helplessness in that local courtroom, the sneering faces of Reed and Smith, the dismissive gavel of Judge Wallace. She hadn't sought revenge, she had sought justice, a justice that was bigger than her own personal slight. She had wanted to ensure that no one else would suffer what she and countless others had endured. The satisfaction wasn't in their downfall, but in the knowledge that the system was, however incrementally, beginning to heal. The long road had been worth it. The struggle had been immense. But standing there, a federal judge initiating a nationwide reform, Amara James felt a profound sense of catharsis. It was a moment not of triumph over individuals, but a victory for the principles of justice and accountability. The city below, once shadowed by the abuses of power, now held the promise of a fairer, more equitable future. A new era had begun, meticulously crafted by the woman who refused to be merely a victim, but chose instead to be the architect of systemic change.